Welcome back. Today, we're really diving into something fundamental for anyone working in radiation oncology. The physics behind generating those kilovoltage X-rays, KV X-rays.
Yeah, absolutely. These are the X-rays you're seeing and using literally every day in imaging. Think about CT scans.
Right, or the cone beam CT on the LINAC.
Exactly. CVCT, OBI on your LINAC.
Yeah.
And, well, historically, they were also the main thing for orthovoltage therapy.
So our mission today is to kind of crack open that KV X-ray tube, understand the parts, get the physics down for how these photons get made,
Uh-huh.
and really solidify this, not just for, making clinical work smoother, but definitely for tackling those board exams.
Definitely for boards.
Okay,
So, shall we start by looking inside the tube?
let's do it. What's the basic setup?
Okay, so picture this. It's basically a vacuum tube. And inside, you've got two main players, two electrodes.
Got it. Two electrodes in a vacuum, first one.
On one side, you've got the cathode, that's your negative electrode. And it's really ground zero for creating the electrons we need.
Okay, the negative cathode, what's inside it?
Inside there, you'll find a really thin wire, usually made of tungsten. That's the filament.
Filament, and you heat it up.
Yep. You run an electric current through it, it gets hot.
Think of it maybe like the coil in your toaster getting red hot.
That's a perfect analogy. And when it gets hard enough, something pretty cool happens right on its surface. Electrons literally boil off.
Thermionic emission.
That's the term, thermionic emission.
Yeah.
The heat gives those electrons enough energy to basically jump off the tungsten surface. They escape and form this little cloud of electrons right around the filament.
Okay, electron cloud at the cathode. Now, what's across the tube?
Across the tube is the anode. That's the positive electrode.
Positive anode. And that's the target for those electrons.
Exactly. It's their destination. And interestingly, like the filament, it's almost always made of tungsten too, but for quite different reasons.
Okay, why tungsten for the anode?
Really critical reasons. Tungsten has a high atomic number, Z equals 74.
Yeah.
And that's chosen for two main properties. First, that high Z is incredibly important for making X-rays efficiently, especially the main type we'll talk about.
Right, you get more like bang for your electron butt photon-wise.
You nailed it. Much more efficient production.
Okay, high Z for efficiency. What's the second big reason?
Heat. Managing heat. You see, making X-rays with these KV tubes is incredibly inefficient. You generate a ton of heat for the relatively few X-rays you actually produce.
Wow.
Yeah, so tungsten has this sky-high melting point. It's absolutely essential for the anode target to handle that intense heat without, melting or getting damaged.
Makes sense. So we have electrons boiling off of the hot cathode filament.
Uh-huh.
How do we get them to actually move to zip across that vacuum to the anode target at high speed?
Right, that's the job of the high voltage supply.
Yeah.
You apply a large electrical potential difference. We're talking kilovolts between the negative cathode and the positive anode.
Okay, big voltage difference.
Yeah, and this sets up a really strong electric field across the vacuum.
Like a powerful magnet pulling those electrons over.
Kind of, yeah. The negative electrons feel this strong pull towards the positive anode, and they get accelerated across that gap, reaching really high speeds.
And the energy they pick up, their kinetic energy, is directly related to that voltage difference, isn't it?
It is. Remember, an electron gains 1 electron volt, 1 eV of kinetic energy for every 1 volt of potential it crosses.
So if you put, say, 100 kilovolts, 100 kilovolt across the tube.
Then those electrons can gain kinetic energies up to 100 kiloelectron volts, 100 keV, just as they're about to slam into the anode target.
Okay. And that maximum voltage applied, that's what we call the kVp, kilovolt peak.
Exactly, kVp. And that kVp value is fundamental because it sets the absolute maximum energy the electrons hitting the target can possibly have.
All right, so now the action happens. These super fast electrons smash into the tungsten anode. What's going on at the atomic level to actually create the X-rays?
Okay, so there are two main ways, two primary interaction mechanisms at the anode that produce X-ray photons. The first one, and generally the most important one at these KV energies, is called Bremsstrahlung.
Bremsstrahlung. Sounds German.
It is German. It means breaking radiation.
Breaking radiation. Okay, that sounds descriptive.
It really is. Imagine one of those high-speed electrons coming from the cathode, entering the tungsten target, and flying near an atomic nucleus. Not hitting it, but getting close.
Okay, close to the positive nucleus.
And the nucleus has that strong positive charge, while our electron is negative. So there's a strong pull.
An electrostatic attraction, right.
Exactly. And that pull causes the electron to rapidly slow down to decelerate and also change direction. It's like it's braking as it swings around the nucleus.
And the physics says decelerating charged particles give off radiation.
Precisely. Anytime a charged particle accelerates or decelerates, it emits electromagnetic radiation. In this case, the energy the electron loses as it breaks is given off as an X-ray photon.
Got it. So the lost energy becomes an X-ray.
Yes. And here's the key part about bremsstrahlung. How much the electron slows down, how much energy it loses, depends on how close it gets to that nucleus.
Ah, so it's not always the same amount of braking.
Nope. An electron might have a really close encounter, lose almost all its energy, and create a high-energy X-ray photon, maybe near the kVp value. Or it might have just a glancing interaction, lose only a little bit of energy, and create a low-energy photon, or anything in between.
So that variability means you don't get just one X-ray energy, right? You get a whole range.
Exactly. You get a continuous spectrum of X-ray energies. It goes from nearly zero energy all the way up to that maximum electron energy, which is set by the kVp. It looks like a broad hump if you graph the number of photons versus energy.
A continuous spectrum. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier that tungsten's high Z was important for efficiency. How does that tie into bremsstrahlung?
Right. The probability or efficiency of bremsstrahlung production is heavily dependent on the atomic number, Z, of the target material. It's actually proportional to Z squared.
Z squared. Okay, that's a huge factor. That's why tungsten with Z74 is so much better than something like aluminum with Z13.
Massively better. You square 74 versus squaring 13, the difference is enormous. The Z-squared dependence is why high Z materials like tungsten are the standard for efficient kV X-ray production.
And efficiency also depends on the electron's energy.
It does, yeah. Higher energy electrons are more likely to produce bremsstrahlung. But even with tungsten and high kVp, the overall process at these kilovoltage energies is still, well, remarkably inefficient.
That's the 1% X-rays, 99% heat thing we mentioned.
That's roughly the figure for diagnostic kV energies, yeah.
Yeah.
Only about 1% of the electron energy actually gets converted into useful X-rays. The other 99% just generates heat in the anode.
Wow, that's a lot of waste heat. How does that compare to, say, a LINAC?
Big difference. At the multi-megavoltage energies in a LINAC, the bremsstrahlung efficiency can be much higher, maybe 15% up to even 50% depending on the energy and target.
Okay, that's a huge jump. Anything else different about bremsstrahlung at kV versus MV?
Yeah, the direction the photons go. At these lower kV energies, around 100 keV or so, the bremsstrahlung X-rays are emitted pretty broadly, in many directions, sort of isotropically.
But at megavoltage energies, aren't they much more pointed forward?
Exactly. Strongly forward peaked in the direction the electrons were going. That's another key difference we'll definitely come back to when we discuss LINACs.
Okay, so that's bremsstrahlung, continuous spectrum, braking, Z-squared dependence, mostly heat at kV energies. What's the second way X-rays get made?
The second mechanism is characteristic X-ray production. These are fundamentally different. Think of them as like the unique atomic fingerprint of the target material.
Atomic fingerprint. Okay, how does this one work?
This happens when the incoming high-speed electron from the cathode doesn't just interact with the nucleus's field, but actually has a direct collision, a strong enough one, to knock out an electron from one of the inner atomic shells of a tungsten atom.
So it physically ejects an electron from, say, the K shell.
Precisely. It ionizes the atom by creating a vacancy, a hole, in an inner shell, like the K shell or maybe the L shell.
And anodes don't like having holes in their inner shells.
Not at all. They want to be stable.
Yeah?
So very quickly, an electron from one of the outer shells, maybe the L shell or the M shell, will drop down to fill that inner shell vacancy.
Okay, an outer electron falls into the inner hole.
And when it does that, it's moving to a lower energy level, a more tightly bound state. That difference in binding energy between the shells has to be released somehow.
And in a heavy atom like tungsten, that energy difference is released as an X-ray photon.
Exactly. If the energy difference is large enough, which it is in high Z materials like tungsten, it's emitted as an X-ray photon. And the energy of that photon is very specific. It's characteristic of the element, tungsten in this case, and the specific electron shells involved in that transition.
So that's why they're called characteristic. They're not continuous like bremsstrahlung.
Nope. You get sharp peaks, distinct energy lines on the spectrum graph. These peaks are sitting right on top of that continuous bremsstrahlung hump.
And those are the peaks you see labeled things like K-alpha or K-beta.
That's them. K-alpha usually means an L-shell electron dropped into the K-shell vacancy. K-beta might be an M-shell electron dropping into the K-shell. Each transition has a specific characteristic energy for tungsten.
Is there a minimum energy needed for this to happen?
Yes. Absolutely critical point. To produce characteristic X-rays, the incoming electron hitting the anode must have a kinetic energy greater than the binding energy of the inner shell electron it needs to lock out.
So if your kVp is too low, the electrons won't have enough punch to kick out those K-shell electrons.
Exactly. For tungsten, the K-shell binding energy is around 69.5 keV. So if your kVp is, say, only 60 kVp, your electrons max out at 60 keV. They can't knock out a K-shell electron, and you won't see those K-characteristic X-ray peaks in your spectrum. You need a kVp above roughly 70 kV to start seeing them.
Got it. So below that threshold, it's all Bremsstrahlung. Above it, you get both Bremsstrahlung and those characteristic spikes.
Precisely. The two mechanisms happen simultaneously once you're above the threshold energy.
Okay, fascinating. We've got X-rays being born via breaking and via atomic fingerprints. Now, how do we actually control the beam that comes out? Adjust its properties.
Right. This is super important clinically. We talk about controlling the beam's quantity and its quality, and we do that mainly using three things: the peak tube voltage, kVp, the tube current and time, MAs, and filtration.
Let's tackle kVp first. We already said it sets the maximum electron energy.
Which means it sets the maximum possible photon energy, Emax, in that Bremsstrahlung spectrum.
But you said it does more than just set the ceiling.
It does. kVp has a really big impact on both the beam's quality, and it also significantly affects its quantity.
Okay, let's define quality again in this context. What does that mean practically?
Beam quality basically refers to the penetrating power of the X-ray beam. How easily can it get through the patient or the phantom?
More penetrating means higher quality.
Yes. And penetration is directly related to the average energy of the photons of the beam. A higher kVp means the electrons hitting the target have more energy, so they generate, on average, higher energy Bremsstrahlung photons. They can also potentially excite higher energy characteristic lines if applicable.
So higher kVp means a higher average photon energy.
Which means a more penetrating beam. We often call it a harder beam. Lower kVp gives you a softer, less penetrating beam.
Is there a rule of thumb for average energy?
Yeah, a very rough one, if you ignore the effect of filtration for a second, is that the average energy of the Bremsstrahlung spectrum is about 1/3 of the kVp value. So a 120 kVp beam might have an average energy around 40 keV, roughly.
Okay. And you also said kVp affects quantity, the total number of photons.
It does, and quite strongly. The total number of X-ray photons produced, the beam intensity or quantity, is roughly proportional to the kVp squared.
Squared. So if you bump up the kVp just a little bit, you get a much bigger increase in the number of photons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like increasing kVp by just 15% gives you roughly a 32% increase in quantity. Since 1.15 squared, it's about 1.32. It's a powerful control.
Wow. Okay, so kVp is a major player, influencing both quality, average energy penetration, and quantity, number of photons via kVp squared.
Correct. It really does double duty.
All right, let's move to the next control knob. The tube current, measured in milliamperes, MA, and the exposure time in seconds. These are usually combined, right, as MS?
That's right. Milliampere seconds are MAs. The tube current, the MA, is controlled by how hot you make that cathode filament.
Back to the toaster coil analogy, hotter filament.
Hotter filament boils off more electrons per second via thermionic emission. So the MA setting directly controls the rate of electron flow, how many electrons are crossing from cathode to anode every second.
Okay, MA is the flow rate of electrons, and exposure time is just how long you leave the beam on.
Simple as that. How long the high voltage is applied and electrons are flowing.
So the product, MAs, represents the total number of electrons that hit the anode target during the entire exposure.
Precisely. If you have 100 MA for 0.1 seconds, that's 10 MAs worth of total electrons hitting the target.
And how does MAs affect the X-ray beam?
This is the crucial part. MAs has a direct linear control over the total number of X-ray photons produced. It controls the beam quantity or intensity.
Linear control. So if you double the MAs, you double the number of photons.
Exactly. Double the MAs, double the intensity, halve the MAs, halve the intensity. It's a direct relationship.
Okay, so MAs controls quantity. Does it affect the quality at all, like the energy spectrum or the average energy?
No. And this is a key distinction to remember. For a given kVp in filtration, changing the MAs only changes the number of photons. It does not change the shape of the energy spectrum, the maximum energy, that's set by kVp, or the average energy.
That's super important. MAs, quantity only. kVp equals quality and affects quantity squared.
You got it. That's a core concept.
Perfect. Now the third control, filtration. We know Bremsstrahlung makes a lot of low-energy photons. You call them soft X-rays. What's the issue with those again?
The problem is, these low-energy photons just don't have enough energy to penetrate through the patient effectively to reach the image detector. They can't really contribute to forming the image.
So they just get absorbed near the surface.
Mostly, yeah. They get absorbed superficially, mainly in the patient's skin, and they just add to the radiation dose without providing any useful diagnostic information. Yeah. They're essentially, well, useless dose.
Right. We definitely want to minimize useless dose. So how do we get rid of them?
That's where filtration comes in. We intentionally place thin sheets of absorbing material, typically aluminum or sometimes copper, for higher energy kV beams, directly in the path of the X-ray beam right after it exits the tube window.
Okay, sticking filters in the beam, what do?
These filter materials preferentially absorb the lower energy photons much more strongly than the higher energy ones. It's because the probability of photoelectric absorption, a key interaction at these energies, is much higher for lower energy photons.
So the filter kind of eats the low energy guys and lets the higher energy ones pass through more easily.
Exactly. This process is called beam hardening. You're removing the soft part of the beam, making the remaining beam, on average, harder or more penetrating.
Okay, beam hardening. So what are the net effects of adding filtration? What changes?
Two main things happen simultaneously. First, because you are physically removing some photons from the beam, mostly the low-energy ones, the total number of photons decreases. So filtration decreases the beam quantity or intensity.
Makes sense. You're blocking some. What's the second effect?
Second, by selectively removing those lowest energy photons, the average energy of the photons that do get through is now higher. The average shifts up. So filtration increases the beam quality, makes it more penetrating.
So filtration increases quality, hardens the beam, higher average energy, but decreases quantity, fewer photons overall.
That's the fundamental trade-off. You improve the beam's usefulness for imaging and reduce unnecessary skin dose, but you lose some overall intensity.
Is there already some filtration built in?
Yes, good point. There's what we call inherent filtration. The X-rays had to pass through the glass or metal window of the X-ray tube itself, the cooling oil surrounding it, and the housing port. That provides some initial filtering before we even add external filters.
Okay, so let's try to recap the controls again. Quantity, the number of photons.
Primarily controlled linearly by MAs, also increases strongly with KVP, roughly as KVP squared, decreases with added filtration, and of course decreases with distance following the inverse square law.
Right. And quality, the average energy or penetration.
Primarily controlled by KVP, higher KVP means higher quality. Also increased by adding filtration, which hardens the beam. MAs has no effect on quality.
Maybe a little mnemonic could help here, like KVP controls KP quality and penetration.
Ooh, I like that. KVP controls KP, and MAs controls Q quantity.
KVP controls KP, MAs controls Q. Yeah, that might stick.
Worth a try.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the anode design itself, beyond just being made of tungsten. Let's talk about the focal spot and something called the anode heel effect. What's the focal spot?
The focal spot is simply the specific area on the anode target where the electron beam actually strikes.
And the size of that spot matters.
Hugely important, especially for imaging. Generally speaking, a smaller focal spot produces a sharper image. It helps reduce geometric unsharpness, or penumbra, in the image.
Sharper image sounds good. But didn't we say making X-rays produces tons of heat? Hitting a tiny spot must concentrate that heat intensely.
That's the major challenge. If you make the focal spot too small for the amount of power, which depends on KVP and MA, you can literally melt or pit the surface of the tungsten anode.
Ouch. So how do manufacturers deal with that?
Well, one common solution in diagnostic X-ray tubes is to have dual focal spots. They actually build two different size filaments in the cathode. You can choose to use the smaller filament for procedures where you need maximum sharpness, usually at lower MA, and switch to the larger filament when you need to use higher MA for shorter exposures or thicker body parts, generating more heat that needs to be spread out.
Dual filaments for small, sharp versus large, heat. Makes sense. What about therapy tubes like orthovoltage?
Therapy tubes often use longer exposure times and might need higher outputs, so they generally have larger focal spots compared to diagnostic tubes to handle the sustained heat load.
Okay, so there's this trade-off between sharpness and heat. Is there any clever design trick to get the best of both worlds?
There is. It's called the line focus principle. It's a really smart bit of engineering.
The line focus principle, how does that work?
Instead of having the anode target surface perpendicular to the incoming electron beam, they angle the target surface, usually at a fairly shallow angle, maybe like 6 to 20 degrees.
Okay, the target's tilted. How does that help?
Because the target is angled, the actual area on the tungsten surface that the electron beam bombards is larger, often shaped like a rectangle.
Ah, so the actual focal spot hit by electrons is bigger, spreading the heat out.
Exactly. That larger actual focal spot area can handle a much higher heat load without damage compared to a small spot of the same power.
Okay, that solves the heat problem. But didn't we want a small spot for sharpness? How does angling help there?
Here's the clever bit. When you look at that angled rectangular spot, from the perspective of the patient, or the image detector, which is usually down below, roughly perpendicular to the electron beam direction, that rectangle appears foreshortened due to the angle.
Foreshortened, like looking at a ramp from the side versus straight on.
Precisely. That larger actual rectangle looks like a much smaller, more square-shaped spot when viewed from below. That's called the effective focal spot.
Wow. So you get the heat capacity of the large actual spot, but the image sharpness of the smaller effective spot.
Bingo. That's the line focus principle. Manage heat with the actual spot size, get sharpness from the effective spot size. It's standard design in most rotating anode X-ray tubes.
Very neat. But you mentioned this angle target creates another effect, the anode heel effect.
It does. It's an unavoidable consequence of using an angled anode target. Remember, X-rays are produced not just at the surface, but within a certain depth of the tungsten target where the electrons penetrate.
Okay, they're generated inside the material.
Now, think about the X-rays generated deeper inside the target material on the side of the focal spot that's closer to the heel of the anode, the thicker part of the wedge, essentially the anode side of the beam.
Okay, photons born deeper on the anode side.
Those photons have to travel through more tungsten material to escape the anode surface compared to photons generated near the surface, or photons generated on the side closer to the cathode end of the tube.
Ah, a longer path through the tungsten itself. And tungsten is good at absorbing X-rays, right? Especially the lower energy ones.
Exactly. That increased path length through the tungsten causes more self-attenuation of the X-rays produced on the anode side of the focal spot.
So the result is the beam isn't uniform.
Correct. The intensity of the X-ray beam coming out is actually lower on the anode side of the field compared to the cathode side of the field.
Lower intensity on the anode side, higher on the cathode side. That's the anode heel effect.
That's it. It's more noticeable with steeper anode angles, which gives smaller effective focal spots, and when you're using larger X-ray field sizes that cover more of that intensity variation.
Is it a big problem?
It can affect image uniformity, especially in radiography. Clinically, you might sometimes orient the tube so the thinner part of the patient is towards the anode side to try and compensate. Modern systems also often use things like shaped filters or digital image processing algorithms to help flatten the beam profile and correct for the heel effect.
Okay, fascinating details on the tube design. Let's bring us back to the clinic. Why is understanding all this KV physics stuff so critical for us as radiation oncology residents?
Oh, it's absolutely foundational. It underpins almost all the imaging we rely on every single day.
Like conventional simulator X-rays, fluoro.
Simulator films, stereoscopy used during procedures like brachytherapy implants, diagnostic CT scans used for planning.
And critically, the imagers on our Linacs, right? The OBI, the CBCT.
Exactly. The onboard imager, OBI, for 2D KV images, and cone beam CT, CBCT, for 3D volumetric imaging right before treatment. Those are all powered by KV X-ray tubes built into the Linac gantry.
So understanding how KVP and MAs work is vital when we look at the CBCT protocols. Why did the therapist use this KVP in that MA setting?
Precisely. It helps you understand the trade-offs. Why did they choose a higher KVP protocol? Maybe for better penetration through a larger patient, or to reduce metal artifact, even if it might slightly reduce soft tissue contrast. Why did they use a higher maze? Probably to get less noise in the image, but at the cost of higher imaging dose.
In understanding filtration, scatter detector physics that helps with troubleshooting image artifacts too, like those streaks you see from hip prostheses.
Definitely. Those high-Z metal implants cause significant beam hardening. They preferentially absorb the low-energy photons even more extremely. Understanding that helps interpret the resulting artifacts. And critically, understanding KVP and MAs directly relates to the radiation dose the patient receives during these essential IGRT procedures.
We should also probably mention orthovoltage therapy, even though it's less common now.
Right. Historically, it was very important. Those units operated in the 150 to 500 kilobp range, much higher than diagnostic, but still way below Linac energies. They were used for treating superficial tumors, like skin cancers, or sometimes moderately deep tumors, where high surface dose wasn't a major limitation.
And understanding their beam characteristics like the lower penetration compared to MV, the higher skin dose, the lack of skin sparing.
Exactly. Knowing about orthovoltage provides important context. It helps you appreciate why MV beams from Linacs became the standard for treating deeper tumors, the higher energy, the deeper dose deposition, the crucial skin-sparing effect. Comparing KV and MV really highlights the advantages of modern radiotherapy.
So this KV knowledge isn't just about imaging, it helps understand the whole evolution and physics landscape of radiation therapy.
Perfectly put. It's all connected.
All right, this feels like a good time to maybe distill this down into some really high-yield clinical pearls. The absolute must-know takeaways, especially with board exams in mind.
Okay, let's do it. Pearl number 1. Remember the two ways KV X-rays are made. Bremsstrahlung is dominant, gives that continuous energy spectrum, and its efficiency goes up with Z squared.
And characteristic X-rays give those discrete energy peaks, the atomic fingerprint happening when inner shell electrons get knocked out and replaced.
Pearl number 2. KVP is king of quality. It sets the maximum energy, controls the average energy, the penetration, the hardness. Higher KVP, harder beam. And it also strongly affects quantity. Remember, intensity is roughly proportional to KVP squared. So KVP controls KP, quality penetration.
Pearl number 3. MAs controls only quantity. It's directly linearly proportional to the number of electrons hitting the target, so it's linearly proportional to the number of photons produced, the beam intensity. MAs controls Q, quantity.
Pearl number 4. Filtration cleans up the beam. You add filters, like aluminum, to remove the low-energy soft X-rays. This increases the quality, hardens the beam, higher average energy, but decreases the quantity, fewer total photons.
And pearl number 5, the anode heel effect. Because of the angled anode target needed for the line focus principle, the beam intensity is lower on the anode side of the field compared to the cathode side due to more self-attenuation in the target.
Those 5 points cover the core concepts pretty well.
That's a great, concise summary. Let's try applying this knowledge. How about a quick problem-solving scenario?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Let's say you're looking at a CBCT image taken for patient positioning, maybe a pelvis case. The image looks really noisy, grainy. You need better image quality, specifically less noise for accurate alignment. You want to increase the signal without significantly changing the overall contrast appearance of the image. Which parameter would you primarily adjust for the next fractions, CBCT, KVP, or MAs, and why?
Okay, noisy image means not enough photons hitting the detector, basically low signal. We need more signal, which means we need more photons, higher quantity.
Right.
We know both KVT and MAs affect quantity. MAs affects it linearly, and KVP affects it as KVP squared. But the question also said we want to avoid significantly changing the contrast appearance. Changing KVP changes the beam quality, the average energy. That will affect image contrast, because how different tissues absorb X-rays depends on the photon energy, photoelectric versus Compton interactions. Increasing KVP generally reduces contrast, especially between soft tissues.
Good point.
But changing MAs only changes the quantity, the number of photons. It doesn't change the energy spectrum or the quality if KVP and filtration are kept the same, so it shouldn't significantly alter the inherent contrast between tissues. So to increase the signal, reduce noise by increasing photon quantity without messing with the contrast too much, the best bet is to increase the MAs. You'll get more photons of the same energy spectrum, leading to a less noisy image with similar contrast characteristics, albeit at the cost of increased imaging dose.
Excellent reasoning. That's exactly the thought process. You identified the problem, noise, low quantity, recalled which parameters affect quantity, MAs linearly, KVP squared, considered the secondary effect on quality contrast, KVP changes it, MAs doesn't, and made the logical choice. Increase MAs.
That really clarifies the distinct roles in a practical imaging context.
Okay, I think I'm ready. Let's do a quick board blitz segment. Fire away.
All right, bring it on. Question 1. Which X-ray production process results in a continuous energy spectrum?
Continuous spectrum. That's got to be the breaking radiation Bremsstrahlung.
Correct. Question 2. You increase the tube current, setting the MA on a kV X-ray unit. You keep the KVP and the exposure time constant. What is the primary effect on the resulting X-ray beam? Is it A, maximum energy increases, B, average energy increases, C, intensity increases, or D, both average energy and intensity increase?
Okay, increasing MA while time is constant means increasing MAs. We just established MAs controls. Quantity, linearly. It doesn't affect the energy spectrum, so max energy, set by kVp, and average energy, set by kVp infiltration, stay the same. So the primary effect is just more photons. That means C, intensity increases. It's nicely done. Step-by-step logic is perfect. Question 3. What happens to the characteristics of an X-ray beam when you add filtration, like putting an aluminum filter in its path? A, average energy increases and intensity increases. B, average energy increases and intensity decreases. C, average energy decreases and intensity increases. Or D, average energy decreases and intensity decreases.
Okay, filtration. It preferentially removes the low-energy photons. Removing the low end means the average energy of what's left goes up, the beam gets harder, quality increases. But since you're removing photons overall, the total number, the intensity, must go down. So average energy up, intensity down. That's
perfect. Again, you're nailing these. Final question. That variation in X-ray intensity across the beam, where it's observed to be lower on the anode side of the field compared to the cathode side, what is that phenomenon called?
lower on the anode side. That's the consequence of the angled target. That's the anode heel effect.
You got it. 4 for 4.
Yeah. Phew. Honestly, after reviewing all this physics sometimes, especially when studying for boards, my brain just feels completely depleted. Like maybe all the useful information got attenuated on the way in.
Chuckles, I know that feeling. Like you've been hit with too high NAs of information, maybe. Hopefully today's session was more like adding some useful filtration, removing the noise, and clarifying the signal. We've all been there with the physics grind.
It definitely helps talking it through like this. Okay, let's try to quickly summarize the key things we hit today.
Sounds good. We started right inside the KV X-ray tube, looking at the cathode with its filament doing thermionic emission to make electrons.
And the tungsten anode target, chosen for its high Z for efficient production and high melting point to handle all that heat, sitting under a high KV potential difference.
Then the two ways X-rays get made. Bremsstrahlung, the dominant breaking radiation giving a continuous spectrum, super dependent on Z squared.
And characteristic X-rays, those sharp energy peaks that are like an atomic fingerprint, from outer electrons filling inner shell vacancies.
Then we hit the control panel, KVP, the main driver of beam quality, penetration, average energy, and also affecting quantity, roughly KVP squared. Remember, KVP controls KP.
While MAs only controls quantity, the number of photons, linearly, MAs controls Q.
And filtration, adding materials like aluminum to harden the beam by removing low-energy photons, which increases quality but decreases quantity.
We also looked at the clever anode design, the line focus principle, using an angled target to get a large actual focal spot for heat tolerance, but a small effective focal spot for image sharpness.
Which leads directly to the anode heel effect, that intensity drop-off on the anode side of the beam due to self-attenuation of the target.
And finally, we tied it all together, explaining why this is so crucial for understanding our everyday clinical imaging CT, CBCT, OBI appreciating orthovoltage history, and really setting the stage for contrasting these KV beams with the MB beams we use for treatment.
Yeah, it provides that essential foundation.
So, thinking about that foundation, we now have a decent picture of how these lower energy KV photons are made and managed, but it leaves you wondering, just how fundamentally different are those high-energy multi-mega electron volt beams that come out of our Linux, and what specific crucial advantages do those differences give us for actually treating cancer compared to these KV beams?
That's the perfect launching point for our next discussion. We've laid the groundwork with KV. Next time, we'll take that big leap up in energy and explore the physics behind the powerhouses of modern radiation therapy, the Cobalt-60 unit, and especially the linear accelerator and how they generate those penetrating megavoltage beams.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Remember, you can complete practice oral boards at radoncSmartLearn.com and subscribe to RadOnc Smart Review for our next deep dive. Thanks for tuning in.